So I want to start by today taking you on a bit of a journey, just making sure we're on the same page. What is housing first? What is not housing first? So I'm going to do this from the perspective of a practitioner. So I'm going to do it a lot from being a guy who has led many very large-scale housing first programs. I'm going to do it from the place of an evaluator. What is a good program? What is a not good program? I'm going to nerdify it a little bit and throw in some academic stuff as I go along. And you'll probably hear me talk a lot about the experience of end users, because all this is completely pointless if we don't talk what it was like or what it's like for the perspective of somebody that's experiencing homelessness. The biggest issue we have with housing first isn't that it doesn't work. I mean, there's loads of evidence that it works. The evidence that it works can be found in all sorts of different places. So you can open up academic journals, you can learn about this thing called housing first. In those instances, there's actually comparative studies to control groups that were not housing first. You know what always does better? Housing first. You can look at evaluations of programs that are not in the academic literature, where people have tried housing first compared to non-housing first, with a pretty advanced methodological rigor when looking at the evaluation. And sure enough, housing first works, and it works for all population groups. But that doesn't change the fact that there's, in almost every single community, one or more person or organization who thinks, except here. Now, the fancy name is cognitive dissonance, but it might be better known as the special snowflake syndrome, which essentially is all of the data adds up for everybody else except for you. And the exceptions that you want to do is you have this really entrenched belief that somehow the population group you work with is different, or that your geographic context is different, or that your organization is different, or that somehow there's like a bubble around where you work, and all these great practices from other places. I mean, for something to be a best practice, it has to be replicable. That's one of the conditions of a best practice. And people say that it doesn't work. Now, this is remarkably unfortunate to someone actually going through the experience of homelessness, because it does work. And I hope that I can actually get you to a place of understanding why and how it works if we have a bit of a deeper dive into exactly what it is. So let's look at some context, just some facts, some figures, some data that I was able to pull up from reputable sources about your community, although I will say that some of the stuff is Syracuse-centric, as opposed to looking at all the different areas covered by the continuum of care, and some stuff is only available at a statewide level. But let's look at some context. So census data for the city of Syracuse shows about 35% people living in poverty. Almost none of those people will be or ever are homeless. So why do I bring that up? Because people want you to believe that there's a strong correlation between economic poverty and homelessness, and there absolutely is not. Yes, it is true that almost every homeless person is poor, but almost no people that are poor are ever homeless. And as soon as people start to draw a line between those two things, they lead you to believe that you need to do things like economic generation to help people out of homelessness, and that is absolutely incorrect. You need to help people out of homelessness to increase their economic generation, not the other way around. Next fact that I think we should point out, there are only 5,226 federally assisted units in the city. Almost everyone that is poor has their housing needs met in the private market. Okay, so this is a little bit, I would say, uncomfortable for those of us who believe that without subsidy, you're never going to be able to help people succeed, especially over the long haul, because almost nobody gets a subsidy, and their housing needs are still met on a regular basis. Now, I know where this is going. You're going to tell me that it's all substandard units and they're all overcrowded, right? Because I've been down this road before. Gross median income for rent is just over $700. Even still, almost everybody on Social Security is housed. 9,990 households are spending 50% or more of the gross monthly income on housing. Just about 800 households are overcrowded. About 400 households are in substandard homes. Almost all of these households will never be homeless. A little less than 4% of New York State's population lives with a serious mental illness. About 60% receive no treatment or counseling for their mental illness. Almost everyone with an SMI in New York, over 500,000 people, is housed. So as soon as someone wants me to believe that there's a strong relationship between mental illness and homelessness, again, I'm going to say nope. 6.6% of New York State's population are dependent on alcohol, and about 3% of New York State's population are addicted or dependent on other drugs. 94% receive no treatment, and almost all are housed. So the second you go down the road of telling me that what really needs to happen is we need to treat people's substance use disorders, I will again call bullshit, because almost nobody that has a substance use disorder is ever going to experience homelessness. Most people figure it out on their own. Pretty remarkably unfortunate facts, wouldn't you say? Because isn't that the mythology of homelessness in a nutshell? I think just about everywhere we go, we have this person, I'll call him the fictitious Uncle Larry. I think we all have an Uncle Larry or no Uncle Larry, right? Because Uncle Larry will say things like, well, all them people, because he will distinguish himself from, they just need to get a job, right? Isn't that what Uncle Larry says? Except for most people without a job are housed. Uncle Larry says, well, I don't want my taxes going towards housing all them people who are just like popping out babies all the time and they're not trying to better themselves. Well, good news, Uncle Larry, because most people actually aren't living in a federally assisted unit. Uncle Larry would say, well, the problem is they're not dealing with their mental illness. If they just saw their psychiatrist and took their medication, everything would be just fine. Am I right? Not true. Or Uncle Larry would lead you to believe that, you know what? If they could just give up the bottle, they'd be just fine. Am I right? Except for also not true. In fact, I stand in front of you as your presenter today, and I can tell you a few things about me that might be even more interesting than my credentials. One, I live with mental illness. I mean, not just one, but two. Don't worry, they're not contagious. You'll be fine. Besides, you don't want a life as fabulous as mine. And the second thing I'll tell you is that I love drugs. Do you remember when Nancy said, just say no? Remember that? Nancy was wrong. People do drugs for all sorts of reasons, but one of the most important reasons is it actually helps people escape from all the pain that they're feeling. What if we looked at this work in a completely different way? And what if instead of saying that, you know, we've got a whole bunch of people with all these deficits, including sex offenders, which I put up there because almost all sex offenders are housed, that we actually looked at this continuum of service in a way than how we had traditionally. So the most traditional model, which you'll find everywhere in the developed world, says, well, first thing we have to do is find people, yes? So we must do outreach. Now, maybe you do, or maybe you just have an advertising problem and people don't know where to go, which comes up a lot when you start doing coordinated entry. I mean, one of the most remarkable things about homelessness is it actually has a strong bias towards people that have been homeless a lot. Put it another way, the longer you're homeless, the better you are at being homeless. But if you're homeless for the first time in your life, good luck trying to figure out your way through a system, because we do not design systems remarkably well for first-time people. Now, once we do outreach, we want you to go to the shelter, do we not? Because that's pretty fantastic. And then if you do just well enough for the shelter, some sort of transitional or grant and per diem program if it's a veteran. And if we do that remarkably well, then you too can move into permanent housing. Sound familiar? There's only one major problem with any of this. There's zero evidentiary base to support it. And billions of dollars are invested on an annual basis around the globe in reinvesting a model that doesn't have any evidence. So the first thing I'll say is that the experience of most people getting out of homelessness is not continuous, nor is it linear. I'll also say that if our systems of support are not designed to actually appreciate the nonlinearity, we're going to appreciate or we're going to be frustrated by people's lack of ability to navigate their way through the things we want them to do. So let's reconsider this. Could we do outreach, especially street outreach, and have people move directly into housing directly from the streets? Absolutely you can. So we need to focus on what is the mechanism by which people that have been rejected by existing services or are choosing to reject existing services don't actually have to go through a whole bunch of other services to move directly from being in a park or in the woods or under a bridge or in their car, etc., directly into housing. That's a bit of a rethink in terms of where we put our resources. But there's going to be a whole group of people that you don't even touch on a regular basis if they don't come to your program. So how do we take our programs to them? Should we have shelters? Absolutely we should have shelters. Whoever said housing first is anti-shelter does not understand housing first. We need, though, shelters to operate in a very particular way, which is with a strong housing orientation. So that is to say, short-term length of stay. We don't have to try to heal or fix you while you're here. What we need to do is get you out of here as quickly as possible. The worst thing we can do within our shelter environment is create what I'll call therapeutic incarceration, which is I just want to hold on to you a little bit longer and a little bit longer and a little bit longer to make you a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better, and then you'll be on your way. So we need to rethink even what sort of resources and programming we put into shelters. Do we need transitional housing or grant and per diem programs? No. There's 3 population groups where the evidence is mixed, and that's it. So one population group would be youth. There would seem to be a place and a space to continue to have some sort of transitional housing for youth. It does not look like traditional transitional housing. Fair amount of work that's happened in the UK relative to this idea of a foyer model, or as they would call it, foyer model of transitional housing, is actually helping people work through some of the development stages of adulthood in a way that actually has more supports, probably not unlike how a lot of us had our first steps into adulthood. We didn't totally distance ourselves from supports. We had some supports to figure out how to launch us forward. So that's one group. The second group is going to be people that have been part of a residential substance use recovery program, who are coming out of a residential recovery program. Do they need a place to stay that's dry? Will they figure out their permanent housing in a wet world? Potentially, the evidence would say. And the third group would be those that have experienced longer term incarceration, where they can use some sort of transitional housing as a pathway to permanent housing post-incarceration, because we can't actually do all the legwork up front when you're incarcerated. But even in that instance, it seems to look more and more like what traditional halfway housing looked like, and less what traditional transitional housing looks like. But the key part in all this is to keep a strong focus on permanent housing, and always permanent housing. Housing, 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 housing. Which forces us to change the question from how can I help you, which is long-term charitable approach to delivering services, to how do I help you actually exit your homelessness or get into housing. And we see housing as a right, not as a reward. It's not that if you jump through certain hoops in a certain way you get housing, but our starting premise is that absolutely everybody is housable under all conditions. So some critical questions to be asking yourself as we go through this journey this morning. Are the shelters and day resources in your community a process or a destination? So if they're a process, they should be the process by which a person or family gets housed again as quickly as possible. If they're a destination, you likely put loads of programming inside your shelter facility, which unfortunately incentivizes the experience of homelessness and increases the length of time that people experience homelessness. So once we start putting employment programs, life skills programs, et cetera, into our sheltering environments, it works against the thing that we say we're trying to achieve. Do you attempt to heal or fix people? As it turns out, remarkably imperfect people are fantastic at being housed. And this would speak a lot to the moral imperatives that weave their way into homelessness. And once we start moralizing someone's homelessness, we see the desire for them to change their life to more reflect our lives and our values and our beliefs and our morality, rather than actually saying whoever you are is completely housable and ready for housing. Do you provide a social service, or do you exercise social control? And that one hurts a little bit to hear. But I suspect a lot of you have rules, yes? And what happens if I don't follow your rules? You kick me out, don't you? I mean, you might have a process by which, like you warn me and you write me up, and then eventually you get rid of me. Except for the population group we're aiming to achieve, rules-based approaches don't work. You can socialize expectations, but you enforce rules. And once you enforce rules, there's nothing about the work that you're doing that's going to be truly trauma-informed, because you're holding all the power. There's no mutuality, there's no collaboration, there's no direct voice of consumer. It's that I'm lucky enough to get served by you. You hold all the cards. If I do what you tell me to do, I'm going to get a specific type of outcome in a specific way. Do you believe homelessness can be ended and that the entire service delivery system has a role to play in that happening? And my fifth critical question, how do you define success? And we struggle with this because while we have improved data and we've improved our use of things like HMIS, what we haven't necessarily figured out how to do is improve our system planning and our service delivery through that data. So for a lot of people, this experience of I put data in, but I don't necessarily see the benefits out. Can anybody tell me what $9.1 million is? Skill testing question to start the day. Okay, so it is, in fact, a lot of money, so I'll say yes to that. $9.1 million is the economic value of a human life, as determined by the US federal government. So, every person that you actually are touching in your service delivery every single day is protection against a $9.1 million investment in the utility of their being. See, we can reduce homelessness, all sorts of economic equations, rather than just talking about being really good touchy-feely helper persons. But I bring up the economic imperative because if I know that the economic value of a human life is $9.1 million, and this has been well established, then why on earth would I ever accept anything other than professionalized services? It's a really weird industry, homeless services. It's the only industry I know of anywhere on the planet where we confuse a big heart with a big brain. That somehow if you care enough, you're qualified. As opposed to actually saying, what are the standards of care and fidelity of practice that we would expect every single professional that's in this field to be able to do? As a result of not professionalizing our standards, as a result of, I guess, feeling that we're doing the right thing, you end up killing people on a regular basis. You don't like to talk about it that way because, my goodness, you were trying hard, but it's really no different than me saying, well, I hate waiting rooms in hospitals, and I'm not a medical doctor, but my goodness, I feel for the suffering of those people, so I'm going to go down and start practicing medicine. You wouldn't want me to do that, would you? Because I would kill people. And yet every single day you touch the lives of people who may have vulnerabilities and acuity well beyond what we'd even see in a regular emergency room of a hospital on a daily basis. But so long as you care, you're doing good enough work. I believe everyone has a right to a future that's not dictated by their past. It's another big problem that we have across this entire sector is we like to ask people what happened. And yet none of you have a time machine to go back and prevent that thing from happening. Nor are most people who do this work counselors or therapists. So what does it matter? Isn't the most important thing what happens next as opposed to what happened in the past? And if we focus on what's next, doesn't that lead us to a different result than trying to unpack someone's entire history? So if we were to go through a history lesson, which is always fun to do first thing on a Monday morning, we can characterize the history of the sector thus. That once upon a time we saw essentially homelessness or the behaviors associated with homelessness as sinful. This is where most faith-based organizations got involved. They would have the ability to actually engage people. So the long history of things like gospel rescue missions and salvation armies, et cetera, start from a very pure place of how to actually help this person get from where they're at to where they need to be. You might even be familiar with expressions like falling off the wagon. That's because once upon a time we used to have wagon-drawn horses and buggies that would go around and collect people and try to bring them back to a place of care. Not a bad thing. Except for in many communities, not all, but in many communities, that is marked by a history of proselytizing and evangelization and not so much just helping people out of homelessness, but rather trying to gain more participants in their congregation and their way of worship. We could fast forward to a time of looking at community-based mental health. So if we follow the history of this narrative, we start in a time of JFK really getting us thinking about what would it look like to have community-based mental health care, except for that gets distorted and bastardized by a guy by the name of Ronald Reagan, who really believes it means deinstitutionalization and closing of asylums and state hospitals, which by the time that Reagan becomes president as national policy. So you can love Reagan for all sorts of reasons, but let's also draw a very straight line between his time and tenure as president of the United States and street homelessness as we know it. Because this community-based healthcare, you know what we forgot to fund? The community-based part of the healthcare. So we had people leave the hospitals and asylum, which became a dirty word over time, but we didn't actually invest. And so we had a whole bunch of people that experienced gross housing instability at a period of time who were remarkably unwell. But then our response to that wasn't one of, I would say, community-based therapeutic engagement. It was one of which we now start having much more legislation that allows people to apprehend people against their will, consent, or knowledge, that we essentially say that if you want to get out of your homelessness, you have to see your psychiatrist and take your meds. But I mean, let's even be clear upon that. It continues to be the only branch of medicine that we use guesswork. Like if you happen to think you're pregnant, we have a test to figure out whether or not you're pregnant. If you happen to think you broke your arm, we have a test that we run to figure out if you broke your arm. If you're having problems breathing, there's tests we do to figure out if you're breathing. You think you have a mental illness, we ask questions and then we guess based upon your symptoms. And it's really no wonder that we continue to get a lot of the guessing wrong. If you know someone who lives with a mental illness, there's a very good chance they've been misdiagnosed at some point in their life. Fast forward from that period to people are addicted and they need to go to detox and a treatment and become sober. So we have this long history of linking our response to homelessness to the war on drugs. How's the war on drugs coming along, by the way? Pretty good? No? So this entire approach, and you can actually trace it through the history, that once we actually started this approach to the war on drugs, one of the major changes that has in the homeless service delivery world, where we essentially say, if you're going to receive services, you have to be clean and sober, you have to go through breathalyzers, you have to go to AA meetings, you have to prove to us that you're actually working on your sobriety if you're not already sober, that you can't be drunk if you come into our facilities, you can't bring your bottle into our facilities, that essentially the only way you're ever going to be successfully housed is if you stop drinking or using other drugs. Again, no science behind that whatsoever, but it sounds really good. And then we got to a place, so you know what? The problem is that people don't have life skills. Well, I will say, no kidding, because we've just spent an entire generation taking away all the possibilities of teaching people that. So now, though, what we're going to do is we're going to create all these fancy transitional housing facilities, which were an interesting idea that completely failed. You're more likely to experience long-term housing stability through self-remission than to go through transitional housing programs. And transitional housing programs hold all the power. And even some of the population groups that people did hold on to for periods of time, one of the biggest ones is victims of domestic violence. There's all sorts of emerging data that shows that victims of domestic violence do way better if they don't have transitional housing. And yet we reinforce this paradigm because we feel it's the right thing. And then finally we get to a place where we realize, hey, guess what? People are people. And if you actually meet their housing needs, they do just fine without having to change who they are first. So I will say that doing this work is a privilege. It's a privilege that I get to do this work helping someone else, as opposed to someone else should feel privileged that they're served by you. But I also say it took burning out in my own direct service work to come to that realization. Because if you run a really successful program, people will just want you to do better and better and better and better and better and better. And also caution you, like what you don't want to do in life is win a ton of awards, because then people think that you have everything figured out, as opposed to saying, no, we're still trying to figure some things out. But fundamentally, it would lead to this journey, this discovery to, and it sounds like a pretty simple question, what is homelessness? At its core, and I think even practitioners who've been at this for 10, 20, 30 years need to remind themselves every single day, all homelessness is an address or the absence of one. That's it. And the second we think of it as anything more than that, we do a disservice to the people that we're actually trying to support. There are no shortage of individuals, programs, policymakers, funders, et cetera, that want to pathologize the experience of homelessness, that they want to see it as something that needs to be labeled and therefore diagnosed and therefore cured. It doesn't work that way. Again, it takes us away from the root thing that we need to be focusing on relative to the absence of an address, and therefore if we just focus on the absence of that address, we get much better outcomes. And to really try to remove it from this notion of it being a character flaw. Being homeless doesn't mean you're a bad person. I think it's fair to say, now I don't want to necessarily put everything upon you, but it's fair to say that we've all screwed up a little bit in life, haven't we? Is there anybody here who's perfect? Okay, no, but is there anybody asking you a whole bunch of intrusive questions to give you the actual end result, which is what we do with most people? It also turns out that homelessness is not a sin. Now, we could have discussion about whether or not certain behaviors are sinful, but one of our biggest shortcomings is to actually focus on that rather than the end of someone's homelessness. Because if you take a look at anybody experiencing homelessness, systems break them down. It's taken me about 30 years of my life to say this out loud and be convinced that it's okay to say, but I love poetry. My favorite poet is a guy by the name of Shane Koizon. He's a spoken word artist. The first line of poetry he ever wrote is, "I will love myself despite the ease with which I lean towards the opposite." How many times have the people you served had other systems of support already let them down? By people that said no, or people that said, change who you are and then we'll give you what you need. That somehow we have this notion of deserving and undeserving. Or that even you've designed programs and services that were first come, first served. I mean, even if I were to ask you last night, in your community, were the people that were in shelter the ones that needed shelter the most, or were they the ones who were lucky enough to get shelter last night? Are the people that need permanent supportive housing, are they the ones who actually need permanent supportive housing the most, or are they the ones that were lucky enough to get it or deemed to be deserving enough to have it? I mean, it really starts to challenge us if we think about the hoops that go in. If ever you try to reverse engineer your entire system of delivery, in other words, let's not start from the position that someone is homeless, let's start from the same position that person got housing and work your way backwards, you realize there's loads of inefficiencies, at which point most of you want to point your fingers. The government needs to do that, this department needs to do that, the city needs to do that, or that organization needs to do this, the COC needs to do this, etc. Because you don't actually want to admit that you're part of the problem. And then you're going to tell me, like you would say to most people, that those are all great things. In fact, some of you will sit through this today and say, yes, that's really great, but let me tell you all the reasons why we can't do that, because there's no shortage of yes buts that are out there. And the biggest yes but is we don't have the right resources, and I will come back to you over and over and over again. The issue is never resources, it's resourcefulness. Are you willing to do things differently with what you already have before you start to tell me you don't have enough to do the right thing? Is it possible that many of the people that you serve struggle to pretend their pain away? Because we have a social delivery system that essentially tries to get people to conform to a certain model of how I go about supporting people. So my least favorite question in all of social work, what are your goals? And it's my least favorite question because we have the right answer to that. If you didn't know, you're supposed to get a job or go back to school. You're supposed to see your doctor or psychiatrist. You're supposed to take your medication, stop drinking or using drugs, and call your mother. Maybe not in that order, but we say, and this is where the mythology of homelessness, Uncle Larry is alive and well, we say the real issue with you is that you don't have a job, and if you just got a job, everything would be okay. Rather than actually saying, how does everybody else who's unemployed, who's already housed, figure it out, and let's replicate it. We say the issue is that you're not actually getting appropriate health care. And if you just got appropriate health care, everything would be fine. Instead of asking yourself, how does everybody else who's not connected to really good health care figure this out? We say that the medical model is alive and well. Just take the right pill and everything will be okay. We say that the real issue is alcohol or other drugs, and if you just do the right thing in the right way, you'll be fine. And we say the issue is that you actually lost your family, which would assume that families are always the most safe and appropriate option for people. All of those things are myths. All of those things are myths. Perhaps the myths that bother me the most are related to substance use recovery. Can anybody tell me the long-term effectiveness rate of Alcoholics Anonymous? It is less than 10%. Alcoholics Anonymous fails more than 9 out of 10 times. Now, if it is successful for you, keep on working it. If you know someone where it's successful, keep on working it. But let's actually be really clear. That makes you a statistical freak. Because the other thing we know about research related to addiction is your opportunity for self-remission is higher if you don't go through Alcoholics Anonymous than if you do go through Alcoholics Anonymous. Which of the 12 steps is based upon any scientific merit? None. None. There are only 12 steps because there were 12 apostles. Bill W., the creator of AA, said because there are 12 apostles, there should be 12 steps. It's born out of the Oxford Spirituality Group. All right? If someone goes to AA and AA is not working, what do we say to the person? Got to work your steps harder, right? You're not letting go enough. You are the problem, not the steps. They'd be like you being diagnosed with cancer, going through chemo, the chemo's not working. So, well, the issue isn't the chemo. The issue is that you're not trying the chemo hard enough. If you just try the chemo a little bit harder, you get a little bit better results. It's a problem, isn't it? Even if you looked at most of the prestigious substance use recovery centers across the country, Sierra Tucson, Betty Ford Clinic, Promises of Malibu, show me any published data by any of those organizations. There's none. And yet, would I be wrong in thinking that for people experiencing alcoholism in your community, the go-to solution for most organizations is still going to be AA? And even if I went into a residential recovery program, what happens if I drink again? I get kicked out, right? In other words, the thing that confirmed that the diagnosis is correct is the thing that you're using to eliminate me from care. So just so I'm on the same page with you, if I'm 21 years of age or older, and let's assume I am, I'm allowed to purchase and consume alcohol in the state of New York, yes? Do we have one set of laws or two in this country? Because the second you start saying that someone cannot consume in order to access services, you're saying there's two sets of laws. That's legal for everybody who's housed, but essentially we're going to deem it as being illegal for anybody who's actually involved in our work. So time is not wasting people. We're wasting time by not having a sense of urgency and not actually helping people get to the place of courage that they need. Courage to actually tell you what the truth is. Courage for us to actually hear that and not try to heal or fix the person, but rather to focus on their housing stability immediately. If we want to do this work remarkably well, and there are challenges in doing it remarkably well, then we also need to come at it from a place of evidence. So one thing that I will never do anymore in my career is agree to disagree, because I think that's remarkably cowardly. Let's be clear. If I have data and you have opinion, I win. Whether you believe my facts is irrelevant, because there's still going to be facts. You sure are entitled to your own opinion, not entitled to your own facts. So as I continue to go through things today and actually outline what the evidence suggests will work compared to historic practices, and someone busts out things, well, in my experience, I will say that I don't hold a lot of credibility for your experience, even if you've been at this a long time, because we tend to work in a sector of service that doesn't have a lot of competition. That's a really nice way of saying you could have been in your job for 20 years and be a complete moron. Can you think of any other profession where we don't mandate that you stay on top of main currents of thought and practice? I mean, even our mechanisms of funding are essentially, here's what we kind of want to do, tell us how you would go about doing, as opposed to saying, here's the actual evidence-informed service delivery methods, which of these can you do at which cost? So we're going to be focusing on data and evidence. And we're going to do this in such a way that we stop thinking about this work as charitable and start thinking about it as professional. In the history of humankind, charity has never solved a complex social issue. It can't. It's not designed to. Can charity feed me if I'm hungry? Yes. Can charity clothe me if I need clothing? Yes. Can charity provide me a roof over my head tonight? Yes. Charity can do all those things and can do it remarkably well. But it doesn't solve the reason why I was there in the first place. How many do-gooders do we actually have who have no idea what they're doing? I'm not saying we can't have charitable organizations, but we need to actually have targeted investment relative to what we're trying to achieve throughout your charities. Yes, sir.
So what exactly does housing cost an individual at a household?
What is what?
What does housing cost an individual and or head of household?
How much should their housing cost?
What does it cost? I didn't say how much.
I don't think I'm understanding your question.
Okay. You're talking about money.
I was talking about money, yeah.
9.1 million, you know the value.
I do.
You're talking about the services that we're looking to provide.
Yes.
Saying that it doesn't always assist or help.
Yep.
So what does it cost the individual who is homeless?
Their life, usually.
Okay, so if we're giving what we have or what we think they need, what are they offering?
Well, I would say that most of the time, and I'm not saying exclusively, but most of the time, we start with one of two perspectives. So we either start with a charitable perspective, which is, I know what's right for you, here's what I have to give you, do you want it? Or we start with what's called bureaucratic responding, which is, this is what the government program says people need, here's the eligibility criteria, do it. What we don't normally start with, which is where we should start, is with needs assessment, to actually talk to the end users and actually figure out how to design our programs based upon what they declare as their needs, as opposed to our impressions of their needs. So what do they put into it? Their identification of their needs is a challenge for us to figure out how our program and service delivery is designed to meet those needs, as opposed to expecting them to conform to what we outlined as our programs. So with that being said, that's why every single support strategy should allow the individual to articulate the type, duration, frequency, and intensity of their supports, rather than us having programmatic models that people have to jump through certain hoops. It's the reason why we need to focus on choice in housing rather than placements in housing, so that the person actually has an active voice in deciding the type of housing that's going to be best for them. And in terms of once we actually get someone housed, what's in it for the individual? Well, their engagement with supports essentially becomes a social contract with themselves. That I can provide a myriad of supports and network and broker and advocate for you to get connection to all sorts of mainstream and other community-based resources. But ultimately, it's the individual or the head of household or the family that has to make that decision that they want to engage in those things. Your or a person or a family's lack of engagement, though, doesn't mean that I'm off the hook. It means that I have to continue to challenge myself to figure out how do I better deliver these services rather than how do I expect this person to change in order to meet what my program has. And this morning I'm going to run through two things that I think are really important in that. One is the impacts of trauma, and what does a truly trauma-informed approach to service delivery mean? And the second one I'm going to look at is propensity of brain injury within the homeless population and how that challenges us to reconsider the ways in which we support people.
Okay, so we're going to treat homelessness as a choice, not a condition.
Well, I didn't say that, right? Because I didn't say it was ever a choice. I would say that it is a manifestation of a confluence of events that's almost always, although not exclusively, but almost always because of an exacerbated traumatic cycle. And so if we don't actually have a way to help people recover from their experience of their homelessness, then we will continue to perpetuate their homelessness. And the last thing I'm going to ask for you today is to try to learn 3 things. That's all I'm going to ask. And if by the end of the day you've learned 3 things and I've done my job and you can go away happy, but then I'm going to ask you to try to use those things as opposed to trying to get perfect by planning around how you use those things. Because as it turns out, imperfect action trumps perfect planning. So I can assure you that homelessness has never been ended in a committee. It's never been ended in a plan. It's never been ended by a whole bunch of well-intentioned people talking about it. It's been ended by doing. And the communities that do a remarkably good job purposely decide that they're going to make tons of mistakes. And they're going to make a whole bunch of mistakes really fast, and they're going to fail forward, and they're going to learn, and they're going to refine, and they're going to learn, and they're going to refine, and they're going to learn and refine, rather than waiting for permission from someone to do the right thing. And if you don't use the things that I'm going to try to teach you throughout the morning and afternoon, then I would challenge you to look into the eyes of anybody experiencing homelessness after this and say, I learned all sorts of really interesting new things, but I decided not to use them. All right, I can tell we're having fun. So let's talk change, shall we? Isn't that ultimately what you do? You're a change agent. In fact, that might actually be a better job title for some of you. What do you do for a living? I'm a change agent. What do you try to do? I help people change their lives. Isn't that ultimately what we try to do? We help people change their lives. But we romanticize change all the time. We are a culture of butterflies that forget there were ever caterpillars. because we want to talk about the end product and how beautiful it is. We don't want to talk about how much that experience actually sucked for the caterpillar. So I'm a caterpillar advocate, so I would like to make sure we're on the same page. For a caterpillar to become a butterfly, it goes blind, its legs fall off its body, its internal organs turn to gelatinous goo, and its back has to physically rip open for the wings to emerge. See, no one wants to talk about that, do they? Look at the pretty butterfly. Like, I'll bet we all know at least one person, maybe it's even you, who has a butterfly tattooed on their body. Don't see a whole lot of caterpillar tattoos out there, though, do you? This doesn't happen. Again, because we love the end product, we don't like to actually go through the journey, the painful journey of change. So you can design the world's greatest program. In fact, maybe you have already. You know, you did interviews with people who lived experience, you went to conferences, you hired the best possible talent you could find, you have a completely robust policies and procedures manual, you have targets in terms of what you're actually trying to achieve. I mean, you've gone to the nth degree, and as it turns out, there's a whole bunch of people who are not necessarily following the mold because they didn't get the memo that they're supposed to be awesome at everything that you figured out. It's part of the reason why it's so important to focus on caterpillars in this process, because of how badly it sucks to be a caterpillar. So, well, I don't even know how to tell you this other than straight up. Like, you suck at change. You're completely horrible at change. I don't want any of you thinking I'm looking at you, so I'm going to take off my glasses because I'm a blind man, and you can probably see from there just how thick these are. You know what? I'm even going to close my eyes so no one actually thinks I'm looking at you. All right, so my eyes are closed, my glasses are off, I can't see any of you. I'm not making eye contact. This is completely without judgment. All right. So I'm going to guess and assume that one or more of you in this room has a relationship that is not healthy for you. This could be with a family member, this could be with a sibling, this could be with a spouse, this could be with a friend. Remarkably unhealthy relationship, but I'm also going to guess that most of you don't change that relationship because the thought of changing that relationship is too painful, and so instead you'll actually go through the pain, or you'll say, well, I only have to see them twice a year, Thanksgiving and Christmas, and maybe a funeral or wedding, and or you convince yourself that you need to stay together for the kids, meanwhile that it's not healthy. You're a big enough group that I could probably say with some assurance that one or more of you in this room has a substance use disorder. Again, my eyes are closed, so I can't point out which one of you actually has really red eyes today. And there isn't a Visine for that. So, but instead of actually addressing it and starting to come to grips with what you might need to do to change that part of your life, you decided that, well, you're just going to continue to function within it because the thought of changing is really difficult. I'm going to guess that one or more of you in this room is probably a smoker. You might only be a social smoker now. You only smoke when you drink, which means that you drink every day so you can smoke. I'm going to guess for my people who are smokers that you know that smoking is hazardous for your health. And the Surgeon General has been clear on that one for quite some time. So it's not an intelligence issue, but you know that you're doing something that's really bad for you, and yet you're not doing it. I'm going to guess that every single person in this room doesn't always put on their seatbelt when they're driving, at least not right away, even though they know that seatbelts save lives. And I'm going to guess that one or more of you in this room, for health reasons alone, so nothing to do with vanity, for health reasons alone, could benefit from losing weight. We actually completely understand the science of weight loss. If your caloric burn is greater than your caloric intake, that you in fact lose weight. But we like to perpetuate all sorts of myths that aren't actually related to weight loss. And even with knowing the science of weight loss, there's all sorts of people in this room who don't lose weight because the thought of having to change in order to do that is just not appealing to you. So that whole getting up early and going to the gym thing, you'd rather sleep than do that. You'd rather eat wings and drink beer than eat a salad. Isn't it pretty amazing that, I mean, these are just examples. There's tons of things you can change in your own life that you just don't change. And yet every single day you go to work trying to change other people. And what do? You get frustrated when they don't change. Or when they don't meet your timeline for change. Or when they start to change and then they go back. I mean, Hell, we all know that you went on a diet and started eating again, didn't you? I'm even going to guess that some of you in this room have done such a good job whenever you've decided to go about losing weight that because you've lost a certain amount of weight, you treat yourself to what? Cake, or pie, or dessert, or a really fatty meal. It's like, I've been doing so good with my diet, I'm just going to cheat tonight. It's like the alcoholic saying, you know what, I have experienced 3 months of sobriety, I deserve to go out and get hammered. You hate change. And you spend every single day trying to convince other people to change. So let me ask you this, why do homeless programs and services exist? This is the Socratic part of the presentation where you're allowed to answer. Okay, I will help you out because apparently you're more tired than I am. They exist to end homelessness. That's their core and only function. So yes, if there weren't homeless people, we wouldn't have programs. That would be a good problem to have. But the fact is we have people that experience homelessness, so we should try to end their homelessness. That's the only reason why any program should exist. Street outreach exists to end homelessness. Shelters exist to end homelessness. Day centers, drop-in centers exist to end homelessness. They all exist only to end homelessness. Coordinated intake, end homelessness. Diversion prevention, end homelessness. That's all we're about, is ending homelessness. For some people, this might mean a little bit of support or no support. For other people, it's going to be more involved for a longer period of time. But let us be really clear, they don't exist to heal or fix people. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because over time, we put in more and more programs to try to heal or fix people rather than actually address their housing crisis. So, substance use can impact programming and people's ability to engage with housing. But the second you demand sobriety or have substance use recovery programming within your homeless service delivery, you're no longer doing homeless service delivery, you're doing substance use recovery. So just stop using homeless dollars to do substance use recovery programming and we'll be fine. But also stop telling people that they have to overcome their substance use in order to be successful in their housing, because that is completely not true. So no urine tests, no breathalyzers, no checking what's in people's fridges or in their closets or underneath their bed or what they're bringing in relative to their bottle within their facility. That if you don't even have some amnesty place for people to hold their bottles, you're going to increase the likelihood of them having problematic substance use. And you don't want to talk about it, but the truth is, even if you let people come in wet, but you didn't let them bring their bottle in, you're increasing the rate of binge drinking. You're putting people at greater risk. And the second you actually test people for the use, breathalyzers, urine tests, etc., you're actually increasing the likelihood of problematic use like anal, vaginal, or oral consumption of alcohol. So well done. They have a clean breath, but now they're actually putting alcohol up their anus. Because you don't make people fart test on their way in. Conservative crowd, you just don't want to talk about that. I get it. Life skills. How many organizations have I met in my travels that have life skills programming for people that are homeless? Can you show me any evidence that links life skills support to long-term housing stability? Oh wait, there isn't any. See, you thought you're giving people transferable skills. You weren't. I'm not saying some people don't need assistance with life skills. Many do. Except for it turns out the best place to teach someone life skills is the place where they're actually going to have to practice their life skills. So if someone doesn't know how to cook, you know where the best place to teach them how to cook is? Their kitchen, in their house. Someone doesn't know how to go grocery shopping, the best place to teach them how to go grocery shopping is the supermarket closest to where they live that takes food stamps. Someone doesn't know how to do laundry, best place to teach them how to do laundry is the place where they're going to do their laundry. The second you start infusing life skills programming into your homeless service delivery, you're essentially saying, stay homeless longer so I can teach you these things, even though those things aren't transferable. Mental wellness can impact housing. But there's absolutely no proof that the delivery of mental health services is going to get better long-term housing outcomes, because most of what we're trying to do is get people connected to community-based mental health services. So if we build that connection and it continues on with them, that's great. But if we have like a psychiatrist that helps people when they're homeless and there isn't the continuity of care once they get housed, that's a problem. Kids, boy. They are fun to make. I have 4. I'm going to keep having them until I have one I like. And they can definitely impact your housing. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. But tell me, why do family services quite often try to have parenting programs? I'm not saying parents don't need support, but great, get them hooked up with all the supports they need outside of your homeless service delivery system. Otherwise, you can end up incentivizing the family to stay homeless because they have way more supports as a homeless family than they would if they were out in the community. Budgeting, yeah, that can definitely impact housing. You know, Uncle Larry says all them people, they're terrible at their money. Except for that's not true. Most economically poor people are amazing in budgeting. Or physical health, yep. Then we want people to have access to doctors, not a bad thing. Except for a lot of programs, you'd lose your doctor or your access to health care if you left your homelessness. So we probably need to figure that out. Oh, this is one of my favorites. Why on earth would we ever have employment programs for people that are homeless? What a dumb idea that is. So let me get this straight. The thing that qualifies me for the employment program is that I am homeless and don't have a job. And so now I can get a job, but if I become housed, I no longer have access to the employment. Or let me guess, it's an employment readiness program? Tell me, what does the literature say about employment readiness programs in this population group? Oh, I'll summarize. It's a bad idea. Then the same way that we don't have housing readiness, that we just want people to move directly into housing, we want people to move directly into jobs with supports rather than trying to get them ready for a job. So maybe we have to rethink the way that we use resources. And we have to invest in change and spend on impact. So what's the change that we want to see? I would hope service delivery system where homelessness is rare. When it does happen, it's of short duration and it's non-recurring. Sound like a good idea? What I don't want to see is a continued investment in programs and services that prolong homelessness or don't have an evidentiary base in order to make them work. So to some of your point before, if we were to look at most of this program and service delivery and design over time, most of it has come out of the charitable sector. I want to be clear, that's not a bad thing. But our most immediate response to people in need is charity. The problem over time is that we will start to institutionalize charity. So there's a great book called Poverty's Bonds. It's a remarkably dry read. It's a Foucaultian analysis, the power dynamics that exist in human services. But anyway, Patrick Berman is the author. But he argues, and I think quite rightly, that in the beginning, if we have charity, that charity just begets more charity, and charity comes with certain morality that's attached to it. And we could look at all sorts of things, but let's not pick within our own sector. Let's look at food insecurity just as a good example. So I think that we could all agree too many people experience food insecurity. They don't have enough to eat. Are we down with this? You agree with me that we have a lot of food insecurity? And so our mechanism to address that was things like food banks, second harvest programs, food pantries, community gardens, et cetera. Yes? None of those things will actually solve the food insecurity issue. So yeah, they can help me be fed today. That's not a bad thing. But they don't solve the problem why I had food insecurity in the first place. But when you talk about institutionalized charity, what do we do? I mean, corporations will get behind this. I mean, there's usually some sort of like food drive that happens around Thanksgiving because, you know, you can't have a good Thanksgiving if you're homeless unless there's turkey. You know, or around the holiday season, you know, the canned food drives. A lot of schools will have food drives in different communities, sometimes even like firefighters that will like organize the food drive and kind of get working towards a charitable response to food. But meanwhile, we're letting a whole bunch of people off the hook, aren't we? Imagine if the same energy went into advocating that people actually had a livable wage or enough and actual benefits to purchase their food on a regular basis. But instead, we've institutionalized the charity. Same is true to some degree in homeless services. Just about every community has one or more empire that's been built out of charity. And once they go down the asset realm, so we have buildings or we have a campus, and we have charity, essentially we need a certain amount of fundraising just to maintain the asset, let alone deliver the programs. But we look at the presence of the asset as benefit to the community rather than asking ourselves what happens within those walls. One more soapbox moment with charity. You tend to use the people that you serve as your guinea pigs, as your pawns, to make you more money. So it'll be, I don't know, early December. And the newspaper or the local television station has come looking for a story because there's a whole group of people in this community that will not have a Merry Christmas unless they've done something charitable for people in need. And they'll say, well, we just want to interview one of your people or one of your families. And you do, don't you? But when the media come calling, you don't find the typical person or the typical family. You don't find the one that's like most of them. You find the one that's like most unlike almost everybody, the one that's succeeded way more than everybody else. Because you want everybody else on the outside to believe that that's what you do, that's who you serve, those are the outcomes you get on a regular basis. And it's all BS. Because you know that that equals good money. To an outside person, they believe that we perform that miracle on everybody. Cha-ching. You know, some really well-intentioned group wants to do a toy drive, right? Because people can't have a Merry Christmas unless all the kids have toys. What if that same amount of money and effort went into housing those same families? We don't want to talk about that. We want to say, you know what? We don't want your Barbies, but we want some first and last. Pony up. No, we wouldn't do that. Wouldn't dare do that. Even when you have an annual general meeting or you have a philanthropic organization that wants to get a better handle on what you're doing, you will take them for what I'll call the Homeless on the Zoo tour to go through your facility and meet some people who are actually in there right now, instead of actually saying that, you know what, that's all charity. That's all poverty porn. That's all me trying to play with your heartstrings to get you to give us money. And none of that is real. Because homelessness, as it turns out, is human suffering, and you cannot spin human suffering. Next step up is this idea of bureaucratic responding. So if we were to track over time, once government gets involved in any level of government, doesn't matter if it's federal government, state government, county government, local government, doesn't really matter. But once we get in and government starts to invest tax dollars, we have a program. And the program has certain policy objectives that it's trying to achieve. I mean, very rarely do they say, here's $100,000 or $500,000 or $1 million, just figure it out. You know, because a whole bunch of elected officials who are supposed to represent us, right, we put them into office, who have like zero subject matter expertise, are the ones who are actually designing programs. Can you imagine if we let elected officials design health policy? We get a very different response, right? But it becomes the human services who say, of course, you're the experts. You tell us what you want. And they often will invest in all sorts of asinine things. And I'll even say they can like suck and blow at the same time, which is impossible. It's like trying to lick your own elbow. You can't do it. They'll say, we want you to only use your money in ways that are prudent, that has strong quality, except when my office calls, and then I want you to drop everything immediately and help that person or that family. Here's the program guides. Don't you dare follow them, because that would be an issue for an audit, unless there's a bad news story that's actually happening, in which case I want you to break all the rules to fix it ASAP. Sound familiar to anybody? When really the answer to designing really effective programming starts with actually asking people what they need. We make loads of assumptions in charity and bureaucratic responding. I can assure you, because it's been well established, the people that are homeless need housing. That's actually the thing that they need the most. And we can actually figure out how to do that. It's actually not particularly difficult. It's a pretty simple solution. And yet we tend not to focus on that need right away. And then when we think about supports and how do we actually support people once they're actually in that, we again, we don't focus on needs assessment. We tend to focus more on like, what did our program say that they needed to do? And I mean, there are times where I will pull up my hair, which, I mean, look at this. I mean, that's a thing for me to have to pull this out. Where I will say, like, to many governments, like, why is it you're requiring that of someone? Because that's back to the bureaucratic response. So things that for example, we know that people don't need in order to be successful in housing, like I can move you into housing and then figure it out, are things like income. I can definitely get you into housing and then sort out your income if I actually have an investment pool, if I have money that allows me to do that. And yet there's lots of programs, sometimes starting from a place of funders, that say you have to prove to us that you have an income before we can assist you with things that are designed for people that are poor. What a dumb idea. And then we want to develop some community, don't we? Because that makes us feel really good. And when I say community development, a lot of you have a very utopian understanding of what I mean by community development. So as a professor of community, I should probably break it down for you, a few things that meet the example of community. ISIS is an example of community. KKK is an example of community. Street gangs are examples of community. Those weren't the communities you were thinking about, though, was it? You were thinking about like nice, touchy-feely neighborhood, Rockwellian type communities. Okay, great. You actually have to make that happen, because all a community is a group of people with shared values and beliefs. That's all it is. So if you actually want to develop that, chances are we're trying to integrate people into our existing neighborhoods with shared values and beliefs of the people that are around them. So once we start stigmatizing people or ostracizing or ghettoizing people, we take away that ability, which is why we don't just need a response in a neighborhood. We need to be thinking across all of our community, what are the places and ways in which we can actually make this work happen so that people can achieve personal advocacy, which ultimately is the goal. The goal is personal advocacy. You exercise personal advocacy. I'll give you examples of personal advocacy. This evening, you will likely decide what you're going to have for dinner. Maybe you've already decided it's defrosting, or it's in the slow cooker, it's leftovers from last night. But personal advocacy, you figure out which food will be consumed by your body. This might have been done in partnership with other people you lived with, but that's a good example of personal advocacy. If I'm experiencing homelessness and I rely upon charity for food, what you serve is what I eat. You've taken away my personal advocacy. Give you another example. If I'm housed on my own, I decide when I want to go to bed. When I have to be there, when lights are off, etc., what time I have to wake up in the morning. If you don't have personal advocacy, so if you're relying upon others for your housing and shelter needs, quite often someone else says, here's the time you have to be back, here's when lights are off, here's quiet time, etc. I'm not saying there aren't reasons why that kind of structure exists, but that's not personal advocacy, so let's not kid ourselves and pretend that people have personal autonomy in that. They don't. But if you take these ideas and these notions and you put them out to any sort of organization or group of organizations, or even when you do this work internationally, there's no shortage of, especially really well-established entities that are much like an old-growth forest. Now, if you've never been to an old-growth forest, a beautiful thing to look at. If you've seen an aerial view, all you see is the green, lush canopy. If you find yourself on the forest floor of an old-growth forest, it's pretty shady. It's not a whole lot of sunlight is actually getting through because of the lush canopy. The other thing you notice in an old-growth forest, not a new tree growth, right? So all the existing old trees, that's intentional on their part. They want to make sure nothing new tries to steal their nutrients, so their root network takes all the moisture, all the nutrients. Their leaves block out all the sunlight. If you're a new tree trying to grow in an old-growth forest, good luck. It's kind of like trying to get new ideas going in a community that has well-established ideas, that every existing bastion of the old growth wants to block that out. So I advocate that if we really want to be amazing at doing these things, we need a little creative destruction. That's really what we need. Much like forest fires. So once upon a time, everybody thought forest fires are bad, till a whole bunch of biologists and other experts it basically helped us understand that actually forest fires are a really good thing. That there are certain species that cannot reproduce unless they're under exceptional heat and stress, like the jack pine or the beautiful sequoia. It's also, by the way, really good for diversity in animals, right? Because forest fires happen and Bambi runs to a different part of the forest, which means in the future that Bambi's going to get it on with other deer. But if they stayed in the same part of the forest, they just kept getting it on with the same deer over and over again. And we want our deer to be diverse genetically. But if I were to say to you, what should you destroy in your current service delivery to reinvest in something new, most people freak right out. If I speak to a COC, and sometimes I just speak to continuum of care or just to government funders, the challenge that I ask them quite frequently is, if you could take 20 to 30% of your existing investment and stop funding certain things and start funding new things, how would that change your outputs and outcomes? Because the truth is, most people who do this work year over year see their funding as an annual renewal. Because they have staff, and those staff have rent and mortgages and student loans and car payments, et cetera. We don't ever think about what's the thing that we need to actually cannibalize within to get the outputs or outcomes. Back to the end user's perspective, I can assure you most people that experience homelessness would like to get out of homelessness and have great programs that actually help them do that, rather than just making sure that you're happy. And we can look into the private sector for ways of doing this, because there's a lot of private sector entities that intentionally go to their existing product line, their existing capital on an annual basis to find the money to do the new thing. One of the most talked about is 3M, the makers of the Post-it note. Now, they're never going to get rid of the Post-it note, but there's some things in their product line every year, about 15%, they just stop doing and making that product, and they use that 15% to create the next new thing, as opposed to saying the only way we create new things is to have more money. And if you do this really well, I was really interested to hear, and I thought it was great that now everything's aligned to housing first. So congratulations, you've done it. Except for I'm going to assume that a whole bunch of you are still trying to figure out exactly what that means. Because it usually means a time of renewal and reorganization. How are we going to pull this off exactly? What exactly does this mean? If we don't do this amazingly well, are they just going to take all of our money away? What do you want to say?
I was just going to say, I think it's more than just clicking that button on the application as well.
What? It's more than clicking a button on an application. It's more than just you have to practice it?
Right.
Tell me more.
So, there's the, 4 questions regarding housing first.
I do know the 4 questions.
4 questions about low barrier. And then, it populates, yes, you're housing first, but then you look at, occupancy agreements, you do site visits, you go through the files, and it's...
None of those things are lining up?
No.
It's kind of like, and maybe some of you still are, maybe some of you have, you do online dating, right? And you create a dating profile. And I bring this up because some of you probably actually then met that person and realized you are nothing like your profile. Right? You told me you were athletic. No, you're not. Maybe back in high school 30 years ago, but not so much anymore. You told me that you were witty and funny, and you haven't said one funny thing to me. You say that you're health conscious, but you wanted us to go to McDonald's. There's all sorts of things that just don't add up, and it's the same sort of way. It's if I just tell you that I'm housing first, that doesn't actually make me housing first. I actually have to practice housing first. But at that time of renewal and reorganization, I would also say there's a lot of organizations, really well-intentioned practitioners who are so worried about screwing it up. And it's kind of like you, the second you start doing change and you don't necessarily like it or you're feeling uncomfortable, you immediately go back to that which is most familiar. It's your default. Our minds, we love the hypothetical. We love it. If I were to say to you, let's end homelessness, most of you in this room would be like, yes, let's end homelessness. Until I say, here's how you end homelessness. No. No, let's not end homelessness. Well, I don't really want to say that. I actually still want to say let's end homelessness, except for let's not actually do those things that end homelessness, because that makes me feel uncomfortable. If you've ever gone through a forest after there's been a forest fire, it's a remarkably scary place, because there's no sound of anything. And then when new ideas do take root with rebirth, the other thing I can assure you is that not everything that starts to grow is going to stay growing. That a whole bunch of it just falls by the wayside. That you don't have to have the stuff perfect, you just have to be moving in that direction. All right. This is a picture of what cake? And can you tell what type of cake that is from the photo? Which is the best of all cakes, am I right? Just so we're on the same page. And if you disagree with that sentiment, then I would ask you to leave at the break. Because of all the cakes that can possibly existing in the universe, this is by far, by leaps and bounds, the best of all cakes. Now, It turns out cake generally and red velvet cake, as an example, are good examples of simple systems. If you have the right ingredients, right instructions, and right equipment, you can make a red velvet cake, even if you've never made one before. You know why? Because it's simple. Oh, I didn't say it was easy. That's something completely different. I said it was simple. If you made a lot of cakes, so if you became a master baker, I have to be very careful how I say that. Then if you are a master baker, chances are it gets simpler or easier to make this over time because you know what you're doing. But the first couple of times probably really hard, but still simple, because if you use those ingredients right and that equipment right and you follow those instructions right, you get that. And I also want to be clear, that is delicious. That's a simple system. This is a little bit harder to figure out. This is actually mission control at NASA. And this is a really good example of a complicated system, because the way that space travel actually pans out is you need a mission controller. You need someone that holds everything together. So we find a whole bunch of talented people, right? So we need different types of expertise, right? So we need, I don't know, rocket propulsion. You can be rocket propulsion. You can be health systems. Congratulations. You can be navigation. You can be spacesuit designer. That's an important role. Okay, that's enough roles. You know what, and I'll make you mission control. All right, so if everybody does what they're supposed to do and reports into you and you are sure they're doing the right things, then we get to the moon, plunk down a flag, play around to golf, turn around, come back, right? But let's say our spacesuit designer, lovely woman. I mean, everybody just loves working with her. Cheery, sometimes brings in cookies or muffins. Like that one coworker where you say, like, oh, you wouldn't believe what my kids did this weekend. You're like, I don't know, tell me, show me. Like, I need to see pictures. Like, they will stop everything for you. Like that rare coworker Monday morning who actually asks, how was your weekend, and cares. You know that sort of person? They're really annoying. But everybody loves them. But not so good at the spacesuit design. Like every prototype we try essentially means dead astronaut. Would you keep her around? So it's insufficient that she's nice. She actually has to know what she's doing to keep her around too. Okay, this is important. In this line of work, we like to use words like partner a lot, but we don't actually like to partner. We just like to go to meetings together. Or collaboration, we love that word. Let's collaborate, which is a post-industrial word. It actually means to labor together, to do work together. And you don't really like to collaborate either. You like to keep doing what you've always been doing, and so if someone else wants to kind of join your party, you're down with that. It's very different from mission control. So one of the things about coordinated entry is we're trying to help the right person or family get to the right intervention in the right order relative to their needs. That's what we're trying to do. That requires a higher order function, because your systems of support are not easily navigable, especially for someone who's been homeless for the first time in their life. If we don't have a mission controller, there's a whole bunch of you who might be really well-intentioned, but much like my lovely spacesuit designer, who's a fantastic person, you kill people. And this is a picture of a what? Baby. Aww. Now I'm going to assume that many of you in this room have some of those, that you're breeders. And if you don't have any of your own, or some that you got from other people, that you yourself were one of those at one point in time in your life. I mean, maybe not that cute. But babies, children, people are a really good example of complex systems. So with babies, for example, you have your values, your beliefs, your morals, your framework within which you raise your kids, or you were raised. But kids don't turn out the way that you expected them to, do they? That's why mommy needs a glass of wine at the end of the day. It's a child welfare issue. No, because children are influenced by things completely outside your control. They go to school and they're influenced by their classmates and their teachers. Most of us in this room could tell a very positive story about a teacher or a college professor that helped inform the person that you became. And a lot of kids play sports and are influenced by their teammates and their coaches. And if you have a place of worship that has a youth program or kids program, that experience might have imprinted upon you in a different way. But that's a really good thing. But that's how complex you are. Because if you can think about the universe of things that can influence a kid, some will have really strong influences, some won't. The experience of homelessness, as it turns out, remarkably complex. It's why no two homeless individuals, no two homeless families are exactly the same. It's why predicting homelessness is next to impossible. It's why most prevention programs are a complete waste of time and money. So you think you can prove cause and effect if you help people out with arrears and utility assistance and stuff, but you can't. Because if you actually look at the data where there's been control groups of a group of people that didn't get those things, almost none of those people ever become homeless when they don't get the thing. But you drew a correlation where there wasn't one, that you gave them the thing, therefore prevented their homelessness. The way in which you're trying to serve people experiencing homelessness is pretty complicated. I mean, think of when you did the go-around of introductions this morning, how many different entities and programs are represented here in this room today. To someone who is like newly experiencing homelessness, trying to figure out how to get the right person to the right program or the right family to the right program, probably comes down more to luck right now than anything else. But the thing we're trying to do is pretty simple. Figure out how to get you out of homelessness as fast as possible. If you think about systems before and after Housing First, they have certain characteristics. So before Housing First, we see almost everything on the emergency side of things. So people are unstable. Historically, we would have looked at risk factors. So, you know, because you would tell me historically that there aren't a lot of landlords that want to work with you. You have to really protect your landlords, and you have to make sure only your best clients are going to certain landlords. So you keep essentially saying there's a whole bunch of people who are unhousable. You try to measure housing readiness, perhaps, and you probably don't have a whole lot of like expectations. You have a lot of rules, and you probably have a fair amount of time invested in using experience to figure out what people need. And then post-Housing First, we say like most of our investment is actually on the housing and support side of things, not on the emergency side of things. We actually want to see higher risk as a good thing or higher acuity as a good thing. That we want to put most of our emphasis in getting rid of these rules or requirements or having as few of them as possible. Really targeted investment if we are going to do prevention, and having some sort of evidence-informed common assessment tool like the VI SPDAT or SPDAT, whatever they are. So if we're going to start to practice this Housing First thing, we have to realize it's two things. It is both a philosophy and an intervention. And that's an important distinction, because most communities, when they say, well, we're doing Housing First, they're actually not talking about the interventions. They're talking about the philosophy. So if we put that in street outreach, it means we survey everybody, we identify those with the needs most, who have the greatest needs, we house them. We don't provide any sort of survival support. So no sleeping bags, no tents, no food, nothing. In day centers or drop-in centers, we survey everyone, identify those with the deepest needs, we house them. If we have shelters, we divert everyone that has a safe and appropriate alternative, have a strong orientation towards housing and everything we do, and we're as low barrier as possible. And I mean every shelter is as low barrier as possible, not just saying we have a low barrier shelter. All sheltering should be low barrier. And primitive supportive housing also as low barrier as possible, reserved for those of the deepest need and very low income. And then we support people to make sure we stay. So we sort of say this philosophy across the system essentially says, let's focus on getting everybody into housing without any sort of preconditions or hoops to jump in first. So as this philosophy, it really comes down to this belief that you can rapidly house an individual or a family, so any sort of household, without them being compliant, without them being sober, without them being employed or with income. So we take away all those traditional barriers and we say everybody is going to be completely housable. They don't have to go through a transitional housing program first to be in position to be successful. So that would fly in the face of a Housing First philosophy, because it's not permanent housing, and Housing First is all about permanent housing, not about transitional or any sort of graduated program. As I said before, perhaps with the exception of some youth-based programs, post-incarceration programs, and programs for people that are leaving longer-term residential recovery programs. You also don't have to be nice. So let's be really clear that Housing First will serve people who are jerks, or if you're more familiar with the layperson vernacular, assholes. So you have to be able to serve people or want to be able to serve people that may be in your face, may say really rude things, might even say things that are completely inappropriate, and you say, well, I'm going to house you anyway. But then it's an intervention, and this word intervention is an important one because intervention means I'm deliberately interfering in your life. That's what the word means. So I'm not okay with the status quo. I'm not okay with you still being homeless, so I'm going to disrupt or interfere your homelessness. That's what the intervention is. Now, if you look at the data, and we say that Housing First is an evidence-informed practice that's proven to get certain results, the data, the studies, the research is about the intervention. It's not about the philosophy. Which is why you can have an organization, a program, a community that says, well, we did Housing First and it didn't work, but then I could look under the hood and say, well, you might have adopted the philosophy, you didn't adopt the intervention, so you weren't actually doing Housing First. So it's no wonder it didn't work. So it's an intervention that requires action to improve a situation, so you're going to take direct action. It requires that there's an interference into the affairs of others, which is their homelessness. That's the thing we're interfering with. And the persuasion to consider alternatives to their homelessness. So it's voluntary. I don't force you to do this, I don't trick you to do this, I don't coerce you to do this, I don't contract you to do this. I lay it out there, you decide whether or not you want it, but the persuasion of the other alternatives is we can do things differently than the status quo. Do you want to get on board with that? To deliver that, there's 3 different approaches you could use. So one is something called critical time intervention. It has a specific model of service delivery. You get trained in critical time intervention. This is particularly good with rapid rehousing type interventions. It's usually 9 months or less. In the traditional model of CTI, there's some abbreviated models, but has 3 different phases or components that go into it that helps the individual or family achieve housing stability by doing certain things in a certain order in a certain way. The other approach, recovery-oriented housing-focused intensive case management, also known as excellence in housing-based case management. So that's my contribution to the field. So the strong evidentiary base, if you do a certain type of housing supports and intensive case management in a certain way, you'll get certain results over the long term with a certain type of housing stability. Again, you have to be trained. You can't just declare that you're going to do it. And then the third, and perhaps the most famous, is recovery-oriented housing-focused assertive community treatment, also known as the Pathways to Housing model and all the work of Samson Barris. So if you look at these 3 models, they all are delivered in slightly different ways. So this is the most medicalized of the models. So psychiatrist on staff, nurse on staff, intensive case manager, team lead, all those sorts of professions all on staff. You often have an occupational therapist. Really expensive to run. Low staff to client ratio is about 1 to 10. Really it has to be reserved for those with the deepest needs, and those individuals essentially thrive and do well if they have a mental health diagnosis. The recovery-oriented housing-focused is a bit larger in terms of case sizes, in terms of case loads. It does allow for a certain programmatic model that looks at certain steps and things that need to be done, the utility of improving housing stability and a certain way of delivering that intensive case management, critical time intervention, again, some lower staff to client ratios because of certain functions that are done in certain time sequences. So if you said you're doing housing first and you meant the intervention, you'd actually have to declare which of these 3 that you're doing, all of which we could actually measure your fidelity to practice, all of which we could actually determine whether or not you're doing housing first or we're not doing housing first. Now that's really important because as we continue to evolve, to even see housing and urban development or Veterans Affairs or others say, well, we want you to do housing first, most often they're talking philosophy, they're not talking intervention. So if you too want to get results that mean that at least 4 out of 5 people that you're housing are going to stay housed forever, then you have to focus on the interventions. This is all driven by choice, which is one of the hallmarks of Housing First. Because it's entirely voluntary, people are making a choice to participate. So to participate, the program participant has to be informed of what they're agreeing to. So we would outline every single step of what happens and what doesn't happen and do you want this thing. They would have to provide consent to full participation. We don't want to coerce them or force them or bribe them. So you would never have, for example, court-ordered participation in Housing First. The potential program participant is given choices in where they want to live. They're not placed into housing, which does mean that an individual or family could stay homeless longer as they figure out the right type of accommodation for them. Might it mean that it's congregate Sure. Might it mean that it's scattered site and out in the community? Sure. Might it mean that it's in a traditional apartment? Sure. Might it mean that it's something completely different than a traditional apartment? Sure. It's not one type of housing. And the program participant has that active voice in determining the goals they want to set, which order relative to their housing stability. So the goals are only related, though, to housing stability. So we're not going to set a whole bunch of goals, and it's not going to be a dream, and it's not going to be this kind of programmatic nonsense that you say, well, we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. Or you have to have a goal in employment, you have to have a goal in income, and you have to have a goal in life skills. No. The application of Housing First is influenced by a few things: local market conditions, availability of housing and rent levels. Now, this tends to influence the rate at which you can get people housed as opposed to the actual ability to do it. The ability of service providers to orient their programs to Housing First. So can you get on board with doing Housing First is going to be a strong influencer of whether or not you're going to achieve success. And investment in professional development. Because you can't just declare that you can do Housing First and not have ever gone through the training of how to deliver Housing First, which means that most organizations or communities have to say, okay, well, what is our line item? What is our budget? What is our amount to actually get the people that can teach us how to do this, the stuff that's necessary to be able to do this? Which we tend to forget about that. And it's going to be dependent upon funders and whether or not they get it. Poor things. So does it work? So the biggest study that's been done in the world is a 5-city demonstration site in Canada. It lasts over 5 years. Turns out it worked remarkably well there. They found considerable cost savings, especially for those with the deepest needs. Some of you might be familiar with the 1811 Eastlake project that's run by DESC, or sometimes known as DESC, in Seattle. So it's probably the most reviewed program of its kind in the academic literature. And no slouches of academic literature have published some of the findings. So for example, the Journal of American Medical Association, if you're involved in academia, it's like the gold standard of publication. So what sort of things do they find? That wet permanent supportive housing gets much better results. The Journal of Addictive Behavior found change motivation while in housing environment produced consistently better outcomes than with treatment attendants. So expecting people to go through treatment in order to get housed does a lot worse than actually housing people and then seeing if they want to go to treatment. American Journal of Public Health, reduction in alcohol use and a strong rebuttal to the enabling hypothesis. So it turns out really wet programs don't result in people drinking more. It actually results in them drinking less and drinking less harmful things. Journal of Community Psychology, 84% maintain stable housing after 12 months. Journal of Psychiatric Services, criminal history not a predictive factor in housing failure. So you might be thinking screening people out because of criminal history, but it turns out if you screen people in, they're going to decrease the likelihood of reoffending and are pretty good tenants. This study from the City of Toronto, when I led the program out there, almost everybody's really happy with their housing. The substance use changes are probably the biggest one. So after we move people into housing, 49% decrease in alcohol use, 17% stopped altogether, 74% decrease in drug use, 33% quitting altogether, and the drug of choice at that point was crack cocaine. This in the academic literature shows people interviewed and randomly assigned to Housing First, and as it turns out, Housing First participants spend less time homeless and less time in psychiatric facilities and experience much less service costs in comparison groups. So Housing First, as it turns out, is cheaper than treatment as usual. In this particular study, randomly controlled study, looked at people longitudinally. Yes, like the other work, they moved into housing quicker, they have more stable housing. For non-Housing First participant, the use of substance use treatment was higher, and this is the important part. However, no differences found in substance use or psychiatric symptoms between the two groups. So you can make a whole bunch of people jump through hoops first, and they're going to do no better in their substance use recovery than someone that moves into Housing First. Housing First participants able to maintain their stable housing without any negative impacts on their symptoms. This study, 242 Housing First participants to 1,600 individuals receiving linear residential treatment over a 5-year period. Almost 90% of Housing First participants stayed housed compared to 47% of individuals receiving linear residential treatment. This one is actually looking at low barrier day facilities and whether or not that increases housing and compares it to Housing First. Turns out you actually have to have intentional conversations about housing. Just being low barrier is not going to improve your housing outcomes unless you have intentional dialogue about housing. And then there's this very specific type of service orientation you need, but this would be a really good time to see if you have any questions. Yes?
3 slides ago.
Yeah, I'll just, yeah,
What was the
5 years. That was an easy question. Anybody have a harder question? Yeah.
Have there been any other studies besides the Seattle one that you flipped through kind of quickly and I didn't catch in the U.S.
Yeah.
versus Canada?
Yeah, most of these were American.
Most of them were
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I put up 2 Canadian and the rest were American.
Oh, okay.
And there's also some from Western Europe, and there's also a very large study from Australia that was recently completed. So it seems everywhere you go in the developed world, it works too. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about service orientation, and then we'll take a break because you've been working really hard. So there's certain things we have to do if we're going to be saying we're doing housing first in terms of how we deliver our services. And some of these I want to flesh out a bit more, but just kind of set the table. So the first thing we have to ask ourselves, are we trauma informed in what we're doing? Which has very specific conditions attached to whether or not something is trauma informed. There are principles of care related to trauma informed, there are pillars of care related to trauma informed, and there's a specific understanding of what constitutes trauma if we're going to say that we're trauma informed. But we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that trauma, especially people that have lived through a cumulative traumatic cycle or an exacerbated traumatic cycle, have 6 areas of their life that are fundamentally impacted by their trauma. Their physical health, their mental health, their community, their relationships, their behavior, and their spirituality. Now, I bring that up because a lot of our services tend to forget about people's experience of trauma. And if you haven't gone through exacerbated traumatic cycle, then maybe you can snap out of it or conform or be compliant. If you have lived through trauma, then some of the very rules that we put in place that would ask people to change are things that people are incapable of doing because of their trauma. Or you deliver services in such a way that actually does even further exacerbate their trauma and make things worse. So we want to make sure that we're actually looking at things from a trauma-informed perspective. This work has a very strong mental health recovery orientation. So recovery orientation, as it is listed here, is about mental health recovery. Can people get to a place of stability in their overall wellness? And do your programs actually orientate themselves towards facilitating that happening? If we don't look at it from the lens of mental health recovery, knowing that there is going to be a percentage of people that have lived with serious and persistent mental illness, then we could actually be working against the outcomes that we're trying to achieve long term. We say that this is person-centered, not person-directed, and that's intentional. So person-centered, truly drawing from its genesis and the disability literature to say, how do we take an examination of skills and attributes of a person and leverage them towards the possibilities of change to better their lives, which would be different than person-directed, someone who essentially says, well, I want to work on anything and everything, but it may not be related to their housing. Strength-based, which I will say is remarkably hard because it's so easy to see deficits and not focus on strengths. But if we actually have a strength-based approach, then we do want to be really sensitive to this notion of therapeutic incarceration and this idea of holding people down or not facilitating their reintegration in the community quickly. We need to focus on solutions. So much like my NASA example, they have a great expression in NASA is work the problem. So if something's going wrong and we're not getting the preferred output or the outcome, we don't just start blaming other people and say, well, if they just did this and they just did this and someone gave me this and that happened. We say, no, we're going to be solution focused. We accept the reality of the circumstance and we're still going to try to find a solution within that reality as opposed to expecting someone else is going to fix this for us. So for example, newsflash, nowhere in the world has enough affordable housing. I haven't been to a place that says we have enough supportive housing. I've yet to come up to a community that says, you know what? We have like the perfect amount of benefits from government for people with no income. Those places don't exist, so let's like just accept that the unicorn utopia is not there. And the reality within our work is we have to work the problems and find the solutions for people in an imperfect environment. To be non-judgmental, easy to say, hard to practice. Because we like to say that we can do this work without judgment, except when someone lives their life very different than how you live your life. So if morals and values and beliefs are aligned, as it turns out, easy to be non-judgmental. When those things aren't aligned, then you will struggle, especially where legality is involved. Harm reducing, 3 general types of harm reduction we ask you to be experts in. Yes, reduce harm related to alcohol and other drugs. We also ask you to be experts in reducing harm related to people's involvement in sex work. There's something that is not easy dinner time conversation. And we also expect you to be experts in reducing harm related to assisting people who live with mental illness, who choose not to or are not connected to the mental health service delivery system, and or choose not or are unable to receive medication relative to their mental illness. So 3 different types of harm reducing expertise we expect you to have. We expect you to be community-based and mobile. So if you're going to do Housing First really well, I mean, the fancy name for it is in vivo. That sounds a bit too much like a boy band. The ability to take all of your expertise and bring it to the person or the family rather than expecting the person or the family to come to you. So the really best Housing First programs are ones where we would struggle to find the staff because they should all be out in the community all day long. Do we want to progressively engage, which means I understand what you have or what you are capable of doing before I start adding a whole bunch more to you. And we want to be remarkably empowering, which also means accepting of making mistakes and giving people the autonomy to figure out what's going to be best for them under their circumstances, rather than kind of a paternalistic approach of we'll determine what decisions you're allowed to make or not allowed to make. All right, so it is currently 10:29 Steve Jobs time. You have 11 minutes and 16 seconds as a break.